far back in time, before the shaping of villages, before the planting of fields, before the invention of writing, humans already began to act in ways that reached beyond survival. One of the most striking signs of this is the burial of the dead. Archaeologists define burial ritual as the intentional placing of a body into the ground or a shelter, often with care, sometimes with objects, sometimes with pigments. It marks one of the earliest traces of symbolic thought in our species. The earliest secure examples reach beyond 100,000 years ago. In Africa, Homo sapiens lived as small groups of foragers. They followed rivers, gathered seeds and fruit, hunted gazelle and antelope, and faced the constant dangers of predators and disease. In such fragile lives, death was common. A body left in the open attracted scavengers, drew insects, posed health risks. Covering the body with earth provided protection, but burial demanded time and effort. It was more than convenience. It was an act that carried meaning. One important discovery lies in Kafse Cave in present-day Israel. Excavations revealed at least 15 individuals dating to about 92,000 years ago. Among them was a child, carefully laid in a pit. Near the bones, archaeologists found pieces of red ochre. This mineral pigment does not occur naturally inside the cave. It must have been collected outside, ground to powder, and deliberately placed with the body. The meaning remains unknown. Some suggest ochre symbolized blood or life. Others propose it was simply practical, perhaps discouraging insects. Yet the very act of carrying and applying pigment shows intention. Nearby, at School Cave on Mount Carmel, another set of burials was uncovered. Around 100,000 years ago, at least 10 Homo sapiens were placed in shallow graves. One individual had the antlers of a deer positioned on or near the body. Others were accompanied by stone tools. These finds demonstrate a pattern. The bodies were not abandoned or accidentally covered. They were deliberately placed, sometimes with objects from daily life. This raises enduring questions. Did these groups already imagine a world beyond death? Or were they simply honoring the memory of the person within the group? Archaeology cannot resolve such mysteries. The bones do not speak, and pigments do not explain themselves. But repeated acts across time and place reveal a shared understanding that death required more than disposal. Neanderthals also buried their dead. In La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, archaeologists discovered a skeleton over 60,000 years old, placed in a shallow pit, the limbs folded with care. At Teshiktash Cave in Uzbekistan, the remains of a child were surrounded by goat horns arranged in a circle. For many decades, scholars doubted whether Neanderthals were capable of symbolic thought. Today, most evidence supports the conclusion that they too performed deliberate burials. These acts blur the distinction between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, showing that care for the dead extended across species. The world in which these burials occurred was unstable. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Grasslands turned to forests, then to desert. When ice sheets grew, sea levels dropped more than 100 meters, exposing land that is now underwater. In such shifting landscapes, human groups remained vulnerable. Burial may have anchored meaning. The earth gave life through plants and animals, and it also received the body in death. Through burial, the living connected themselves to the land. A lesser-known detail from these early sites is the presence of ornaments. At Kafse, perforated shells were found. They had been carried more than 100 kilometers from the sea. Such shells were likely worn as pendants in life. Their inclusion in burials suggests the importance of personal adornment and identity. To carry a shell so far inland shows travel and exchange. To place it with the dead shows memory. Still, not all scholars agree. Some argue that certain burials might be natural. A pit may have formed without human action. Sediment might have covered a body by chance. Even traces of ochre could come from later deposits. The debate remains active, yet the repeated occurrence of bodies placed in pits, often with objects or pigments, across many sites, strongly supports deliberate action. The mystery of motive remains. Perhaps the goal was practical, to prevent disease, to keep predators away. Perhaps it was emotional, to honor memory, to keep the person present within the group. Or perhaps it was symbolic, to mark a transition, to express a belief in something beyond visible life. Each possibility is discussed, but none can be proven. What is clear is that burial represents one of the earliest steps toward culture. It shows that humans lived not only in a physical world, but also in a world of ideas. Step by step, these practices became more elaborate. Later burials, tens of thousands of years after Kafseh and Skul, contained beads, carvings, and weapons. But the earliest examples already show the roots of symbolic behavior. They remind us that humans have long treated death not as an end, but as an event that required order, care, and meaning. At night, within those caves, fires burned low. Shadows flickered against stone walls. A group might have gathered silently around a newly filled pit. They may have spoken names, or they may have said nothing. We cannot know. But the earth preserved their decision. Bones, pigments, shells, and antlers remain as evidence that they did not abandon their dead. They buried them. From the caves of Israel to the valleys of France, from the mountains of Uzbekistan to the savannas of Africa, the pattern repeats. Early humans and Neanderthals both chose to place their dead within the ground. Each act was small. Each left faint traces. Yet together they form one of the oldest, continuous traditions in human history. The caves of Kafseh and Skul in present-day Israel hold some of the earliest and clearest evidence of deliberate burial by early Homo sapiens. High on the limestone slopes, overlooking valleys once rich with streams and herds. These caves became not just shelters from rain and wind, but places of memory. When archaeologists uncovered their chambers, they found bones arranged in ways that could not be explained by chance. Bodies lay in shallow pits, sometimes with objects, sometimes with pigments, suggesting a practice repeated carefully across generations. At Kafseh, excavations revealed the remains of at least 15 individuals dating back more than 90,000 years. Among them, a child's body was found resting in a dug pit. Near the fragile bones lay pieces of red ochre. This powdered mineral had to be gathered outside the cave, ground down, and deliberately placed with the body. The presence of ochre is among the earliest examples of symbolic action in our species, yet its meaning remains unresolved. Some scholars believe it represented blood, vitality, or rebirth. Others see it as a practical measure against insects. Whatever the reason, the act required intention. It transformed the body from something abandoned into something cared for. The symbolism did not end there. Archaeologists also uncovered perforated marine shells at Kafseh. These shells had been transported more than 100 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast. They may have been strung as necklaces or pendants, worn in life and placed with the dead. Their journey inland suggests networks of exchange and travel, proof that personal ornaments mattered. That they appear in a burial tells us the identity of the individual was preserved even after death. Not far away, at Skull Cave on Mount Carmel, similar discoveries were made. At least 10 individuals were placed in shallow graves around 100,000 years ago. One skeleton was found with deer antlers positioned across the body. Others were accompanied by stone tools. These were not random inclusions. They represent choices made by the living. Perhaps the antlers were symbols of strength or hunting success, or perhaps they were simply valued objects. Whatever the reason, they were placed with care, showing that death required more than disposal. The caves of Kafse and Skull thus provide a sequence of repeated acts: digging pits, arranging bodies, applying ochre, including ornaments or antlers. Archaeologists see in them the beginnings of ritual behavior. The intention is clear, even if the stories behind it remain hidden. The people who buried their companions in these caves lived in small groups, foraging across valleys and ridges, moving with the seasons. Yet they chose to invest time and energy in burial. This choice is set against the backdrop of shifting climates. Around 90 to 100,000 years ago, the region alternated between wetter and drier phases. At times, rainfall turned valleys green and rivers flowed strongly. At other times, the land grew dry and harsh. Humans adapted by moving, hunting, and gathering in new ways. Yet even during hardship, they buried their dead. Ritual endured alongside survival. That endurance speaks of its importance. One unresolved question concerns the population itself. Were the people of Kafse and Skull part of an early wave of migration out of Africa, one that later died out? Or were they ancestors of later Eurasian populations? Genetic evidence is scarce. Their presence in the Levant shows humans reaching beyond Africa, but whether they contributed to later lineages remains debated. The burials could represent traditions of groups that left no descendants, their rituals forgotten except in bone and ochre. The planetary context is striking. At this time, vast ice sheets covered northern latitudes. Sea levels were lower than today, exposing wide coastal plains. The Levant acted as a corridor between Africa and Eurasia. Groups moving through carried with them not just tools and fire, but also symbolic practices. The burials at Kafse and Skull may have influenced traditions that spread farther, carried across continents with later migrations. A lesser-known but important observation comes from the preservation of body positions. At Skull, some skeletons appear to have been placed in flexed positions, knees drawn toward the chest. This posture required deliberate placement. It mirrors practices seen in later Stone Age burials across different regions. Whether it symbolized sleep, rebirth, or containment remains uncertain. But it shows that even in these earliest burials, the living shaped the dead into forms carrying meaning. Another mystery concerns ochre itself. Across Africa and Eurasia, red ochre appears in early sites, sometimes associated with burials, sometimes with habitation areas. Was it always symbolic, or did it serve multiple purposes? Some archaeologists argue that ochre was used as an adhesive in tool making, and its appearance in burials may reflect practical familiarity rather than pure symbolism. Others hold that the deliberate spreading of pigment on bones must carry deeper significance. The truth may never be fully resolved. What can be said with certainty is that Kafse and Skull stand among the earliest confirmed places where humans transformed caves into sites of remembrance. Natural shelters became layered with meaning. The earth of the caves held both the living and the dead. Firelight flickering on walls may have illuminated both daily life and the graves of companions resting nearby. The same space carried laughter, hunting stories, tool-making, and quiet rituals of burial. Archaeologists, working slowly through layers of sediment, now reconstruct those moments. They measure dates with radiocarbon and luminescence, trace the origin of shells, analyze pigment under microscopes. They debate meanings, propose theories, and test them against evidence. But for the people of Kafsa and school, there was no debate. There was only the act: dig the pit, place the body, add pigment, add objects, cover with earth. Step by step, these caves reveal the early depth of human thought. They show that even before farming, before settled villages, before the invention of myth as we know it, people cared for their dead. They connected life and death through gesture and material. They transformed caves into places where memory resided. From these first burials, the story continues across time. Later generations would add beads, carvings, and elaborate ceremonies. But here, in the limestone caves of the Levant, the foundation was laid. Burial became a tradition, one of the oldest shared across humanity. Across the landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, evidence of another species emerges from stone and soil. Neanderthals, close relatives of Homo sapiens, lived in valleys, forests, and mountains for hundreds of thousands of years. Once depicted as crude and cultureless, they are now recognized as skilled toolmakers, hunters, and caretakers of their communities. Among the strongest signs of their complexity is the repeated act of burial. To bury a body is to do more than abandon it, it is to make a choice to invest time and energy in a gesture that extends beyond immediate survival. One of the earliest well-known discoveries came in 1908 when workers at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France uncovered the skeleton of an older Neanderthal male. He lay in a shallow pit, positioned on his back, the arms folded. The soil around him suggested intentional digging. At first, scholars questioned whether the pit was natural, a depression formed by rockfall. Later studies, however, confirmed that it had been shaped deliberately. The skeleton's preservation was unusually complete for bones of that age, further supporting the idea that he had been buried, not left exposed. This find sparked long debates. Early 20th century scholars often doubted Neanderthal sophistication. Some argued they lacked the symbolic thought necessary for ritual. But as new discoveries accumulated, the case for deliberate burial grew stronger. At La Ferracie, also in France, the remains of multiple individuals were found in pits, including those of children. The burials suggested that Neanderthal communities cared for members of all ages. In Kabara Cave, Israel, a nearly complete adult skeleton lay in a depression, with bones arranged in a way that indicated careful placement. Farther east, in Teshiktash Cave in Uzbekistan, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a child surrounded by horns of wild mountain goats. The horns appeared deliberately arranged around the body, perhaps forming a kind of circle. Whether symbolic or practical, this arrangement indicates intention. It suggests the act of marking death with objects drawn from the world of the living. These discoveries together reveal a pattern. Neanderthals buried their dead in shallow pits. They sometimes placed objects or animal parts nearby. They often arranged bodies deliberately, sometimes flexed, sometimes extended. Such acts required choice, planning, and energy. They went beyond disposal of corpses. They reflected recognition of death as a moment that required response. A lesser-known but significant detail comes from the Kibara skeleton. Alongside the bones, archaeologists found the hyoid bone, a small part of the throat rarely preserved in fossils. Its shape closely resembled that of modern humans, suggesting Neanderthals could produce a wide range of vocal sounds. This find linked burial sites not only with death rituals, but also with the possibility of language. If Neanderthals could speak, then burial may have been accompanied by words, chants, or expressions that are forever lost to us. The planetary backdrop of these burials was harsh. During Neanderthal times, Europe endured repeated glacial cycles. Vast ice sheets expanded southward, covering plains and shaping winds. Winters were long and severe. Summers were brief. Forests advanced and retreated. Rivers shifted with meltwater floods. In this unstable environment, survival was uncertain. Yet burial shows that even amid scarcity and danger, Neanderthals gave attention to the dead. They transformed moments of loss into acts of continuity, connecting the body to the earth in deliberate ways. Still, mysteries remain. Were these burials symbolic in the same way as those of Homo sapiens, or were they primarily practical? Did Neanderthals believe in an afterlife? Or did they simply wish to protect the living from disease and predators? Archaeologists cannot answer with certainty. Some argue that objects like goat horns or tools imply symbolism. Others caution that such inclusions could have had practical explanations. The debate reflects the challenge of interpreting ancient acts from fragmentary evidence. One particularly famous case deepened both fascination and controversy. In the mid-20th century, excavations at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq uncovered several Neanderthal skeletons. One, known as Shanidar IV, was found with clumps of ancient pollen grains around it. The discoverers proposed that flowers had been laid upon the grave, making this the earliest known flower burial. The idea captured global attention, presenting Neanderthals as beings capable of tenderness. Later studies, however, questioned the claim. Rodents living in the cave may have introduced pollen naturally. Whether flowers were truly placed there remains uncertain. Yet the possibility reflects how strongly the evidence of Neanderthal burial has reshaped our image of them. Neanderthal children were also buried, suggesting that care was extended across generations. At La Ferracie, the small graves of children show deliberate placement. This attention to the youngest members indicates that burial was not restricted to prominent individuals. It was a shared practice within communities. Another unresolved question concerns the spread of Neanderthal burials across regions. Sites in France, Spain, Israel, and Central Asia all reveal similar acts. Was this a tradition passed along through contact, or did different groups independently arrive at similar practices? Archaeology cannot yet determine whether burial was a universal Neanderthal custom or a localized set of traditions. On a planetary scale, the burial evidence highlights how widespread symbolic behavior became during the Middle Paleolithic. While glaciers shaped continents and sea levels fell, both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals marked death with earthen objects. This convergence suggests that symbolic thought was not unique to one lineage but part of a broader human capacity. Burial was a way of situating the body within landscape and memory, a way of recognizing that death demanded attention. Step by step, The image of Neanderthals has shifted. They were not brutish wanderers without culture. They were communities that cared for their injured, as shown by skeletons with healed fractures. They crafted tools with precision, controlled fire, and perhaps spoke, and they buried their dead. When archaeologists kneel at these ancient graves, they see more than bones. They see the imprint of choices, a pit dug, a body arranged, objects placed, soil carefully spread. Each step required thought. Each step reflects an awareness that death was not nothing, but something that required order. The silence of these burials speaks across tens of thousands of years. The caves where Neanderthals buried their companions echo with absence, yet their actions endure. They remind us that long before cities, long before temples or written myths, other humans marked death with care. The tradition of burial, one of the oldest rituals in human history, belonged not only to our species, but also to our closest relatives. High in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq lies Shanidar Cave, a great limestone chamber that has become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the study of early human ritual. Here, between 45 and 65,000 years ago, Neanderthal groups sought shelter, hunted in the valleys below, and, most strikingly, laid their dead to rest. The cave offers not only skeletal remains but also clues that have fueled decades of debate about symbolism, ritual, and the possibility that Neanderthals performed something resembling a flower burial. The site was excavated in the mid-20th century by Ralph Solecki and his team. Within its layers, they uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals. Some skeletons were fragmentary, others remarkably complete. Among them, Shanidar I stood out, an adult male who had lived with severe injuries. His right arm was withered and amputated above the elbow. He suffered from arthritis in his feet, blindness in one eye, and likely partial deafness. Despite these impairments, he lived into middle age, while his survival suggested that his group cared for him, feeding and protecting him even when he could not contribute fully to hunting or gathering. When he died, he was laid to rest within the cave, an act that continued that care beyond life. Yet it was Shanidar IV who became the most famous. This skeleton was found in a shallow pit surrounded by clusters of ancient pollen grains. Solecki interpreted the pollen as evidence of flowers deliberately placed upon the grave. If correct, this would represent the earliest known flower burial in the history of humankind. The idea reshaped global views of Neanderthals, challenging the stereotype of them as brutish or unfeeling. A flower burial suggested tenderness, symbolism, and ritual, qualities long thought unique to Homo sapiens. The interpretation, however, soon met with skepticism. Later studies pointed out that burrowing rodents known as gerds lived in the cave. These animals are known to store seeds and plant material underground. It was possible that pollen had been introduced long after the burial, creating the illusion of flowers where none had been placed. Microscopic analyses supported this alternative view. The debate continues to this day. Was Shanidar IV buried with flowers by grieving companions? Or did rodents leave behind misleading traces? Archaeology cannot provide a final answer. Regardless of the pollen's origin, the burial itself is significant. The skeleton lay in a depression shaped like a grave. The positioning of bones suggested intentional placement. Around other Shanidar burials, stones and tools were found, perhaps left deliberately. These details show that Neanderthals did more than leave their dead where they fell. They took steps to bury them, sometimes with markers, sometimes with objects. A lesser-known but important discovery at Shanidar concerns Shanidar 3, another skeleton found with an injury to the ribs that may have resulted from a projectile. The wound has been interpreted by some as evidence of intergroup conflict, perhaps even with Homo sapiens, who also occupied the region during that period. If true, Shanidar Cave preserves not only ritual but also traces of violence. Yet even here, burial followed, suggesting that death in conflict was still marked with intention. The broader environment of Shanidar was one of change. During glacial periods, cold winds swept across the mountains, driving steppe vegetation and herds of gazelle, onager, and wild sheep. In warmer interglacial phases, oak and pistachio forests spread, providing nuts and fruits. Neanderthals adapted by shifting their hunting and gathering strategies, moving across valleys and returning to the cave for shelter. Through these cycles, the cave became layered with life and death. Fire hearths, stone tools, butchered bones, and burials all built a record of continuous occupation. On a planetary scale, Shanidar is part of a broader pattern. Neanderthal burials have been found from France to Uzbekistan, each showing variations but united by intention. Some graves are simple pits, others include horns, tools, or pigments. Shanidar stands out because of the pollen controversy. But all these sites reveal that Neanderthals were capable of marking death with deliberate acts. The symbolic dimension, whether flowers, ochre, or objects, remains debated, but the repetition across time and space suggests a shared tradition. An unresolved question concerns diversity within Neanderthal groups. Did all communities bury their dead, or was it practiced only by some? The uneven distribution of burials in the archaeological record leaves the answer uncertain. It is possible that burial practices varied widely, shaped by local customs, resources, or even individual choices. Shanidar may represent one cultural expression among many. The cave itself illustrates how natural features became human landmark. Its wide opening, high ceiling, and protective overhang created a place where people returned repeatedly. Each burial added to its meaning. The cave was not only shelter from weather but also a site of memory. Over generations, it accumulated the remains of ancestors, shaping the identity of the group. In this way, Shanidar demonstrates how landscapes became tied to ritual, long before temples or monuments were built. A planetary observation comes from thinking about pollen itself. Whether placed by humans or rodents, pollen represents the presence of flowering plants in a landscape that could otherwise seem harsh and barren. It reminds us that even during glacial phases, valleys near Shanidar supported vegetation that could have been gathered or noticed by Neanderthals. The debate over flowers may remain unresolved, but the possibility illustrates the interplay between environment and ritual. Imagine, tens of thousands of years ago, a small group gathered within the cave. Firelight flickers on limestone walls. Outside, winds move through the valley. Inside, silence falls as a body is placed in a pit. Stones may be arranged around it. Perhaps flowers are scattered. Perhaps only soil covers the bones. Either way, the act carries weight. The community has chosen not to abandon the dead, but to mark death with action, embedding memory into earth. Today, archaeologists continue to revisit Shanidar. New excavations in the 21st century have revealed additional Neanderthal remains, including articulated bones that reinforce the case for deliberate burial. Modern methods, microscopy, DNA analysis, isotope studies, add layers of knowledge, but the central mystery remains. What did burial mean to Neanderthals? Did they imagine a world beyond life? Or did they simply honor the memory of individuals within the group? We may never know. What we can say is clear. Shanidar Cave holds evidence of intention, care, and perhaps symbolism among Neanderthals. It challenges the old view of them as mindless. It shows that, like Homo sapiens, they recognized death as more than decay. They transformed caves into places of memory, where the living and the dead shared space. Across many sites in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, archaeologists have uncovered a recurring substance in ancient burials, red ochre. This mineral pigment, ground into fine powder, leaves behind a deep crimson stain that endures across tens of thousands of years. Its presence in burials has long intrigued researchers. Unlike bones, ochre is not a natural byproduct of decay. It had to be collected, prepared, and deliberately applied. That deliberate act turns simple burial into ritual, linking the dead with color, symbolism, and mystery. Ochre is iron-rich earth, found in outcrops and soils, sometimes miles from where burials occurred. To collect it, people had to dig into deposits, grind lumps into powder, and transport it back to camps or caves. At sites more than 100,000 years old, traces of ochre cling to bones or appear in concentrations near skeletons. The famous burials at Kafse Cave in Israel, for instance, contained pieces of ochre near a child's remains. Similar finds appear across Africa, where early Homo sapiens sprinkled pigment on bodies or in graves. The meaning of ochre remains elusive. Some scholars see in it the symbol of blood, life, and vitality. Red could have represented the spark of existence, a color linked to renewal. Others argue that ochre was simply practical. It might have been used as an insect repellent or preservative, helping keep decomposition in check. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What matters most is that people repeatedly chose to include it. The consistency across sites and continents shows it carried value, whatever that value meant. One lesser-known detail comes from Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to around 75,000 years ago. There, pieces of ochre were found engraved with crosshatched designs. These markings are among the earliest known examples of abstract art. While not directly linked to burials, they show that ochre was part of a wider symbolic system. People did not simply use it for practical reasons. They carved meaning into it, they wore it, and they carried it into graves. In Europe, ochre becomes especially prominent during the Upper Paleolithic, around 40,000 years ago. At Sungir, in Russia, burials of children were found covered in thousands of ivory beads and lavishly sprinkled with red ochre. At Dolny Věstonice, in today's Czech Republic, bodies in triple burials were similarly marked with pigment. These later examples suggest continuity from much earlier practices. The act of adding color to the dead persisted across millennia, carried into new regions as humans spread. The planetary perspective reinforces how widespread this was, from Africa to the Levant, from Russia to Central Europe. Groups separated by vast distances all used red ochre in similar ways. It suggests a shared human impulse, an early form of symbolic thinking that transcended local traditions. While languages, tools, and myths differed, the red stain on bones remained a near universal thread. Yet mysteries remain. Did the colour represent the warmth of life returning? Was it thought to protect the soul, or to mark a passage into another realm? Or was it simply part of daily adornment, carried into death because it was part of identity in life? Archaeology provides fragments but no full answers. The bones cannot tell us why. Another detail comes from burials where ochre was used even when resources were scarce. At sites where food was limited, people still expended energy to gather pigment. This choice shows its significance. When survival demanded efficiency, symbolic action still endured. Ochre was not abandoned in hard times. It remained central to burial, suggesting that ritual was as essential to human life as food and fire. Some researchers also note that red ochre might have had sensory impact. In firelight, the pigment glows, giving bones a warm, almost lifelike tone. This effect may have carried symbolic meaning, restoring a sense of presence to the dead. To sprinkle ochre could have been to make the body appear alive again, if only briefly, under the glow of flames. Such interpretations remain speculative, but they remind us that ritual often engages not just thought, but sight, touch, and feeling. The debate over ochre reflects a larger tension in archaeology: how to interpret symbols without texts. Written language is absent. All that survives are pigments, bones, and tools. Scholars must weigh practical explanations against symbolic ones, often without certainty. Yet the repeated use of ochre across continents and millennia strongly supports the idea that it meant more than utility. On a global scale, the ochre burials remind us of the continuity of human culture. Long before agriculture, long before stone monuments, long before organized religion, people marked death with color. This simple act, repeated endlessly, carried memory across generations. Children buried with ochre, elders sprinkled with pigment, communities gathering around red-stained bodies, all represent a shared recognition that death was not only an end, but a moment requiring ceremony. In caves and open-air sites, the traces still endure. Archaeologists brushing away soil find bones stained red. The pigment clings, resisting time. It whispers of hands grinding stone, sprinkling powder, shaping meaning. It tells us that in the deep past, humans chose to make death visible, not just as absence, but as transformation, marked in crimson. Imagine the scene tens of thousands of years ago. A group gathers at the edge of a shallow pit. The body of a child lies within. From a pouch or a piece of skin, someone pours red powder. It settles on bones and hair, seeping into the soil. Others bring shells or beads. Together, they cover the body with earth. Firelight glows against the cave wall, illuminating the red stain. Silence falls. The ritual is complete. These ochre burials bridge vast spans of time. From the earliest Homo sapiens in Africa, through the caves of Israel, to the plains of Ice Age Europe, the red pigment appears again and again. It is among the oldest shared elements of human ritual. Its meaning remains hidden, but its persistence reveals much. That humans have always sought to mark death with symbols, to transform the body into something more than remains. On the wind-swept plains of western Russia lies one of the most remarkable burial sites of the Upper Paleolithic. The site of Sungir, near the modern city of Vladimir, preserves graves that reveal extraordinary care, elaborate symbolism, and a scale of ritual unlike anything seen before. Dated to around 34,000 years ago, the Sungir burials belong to Homo sapiens who lived in harsh Ice Age conditions. The graves show not only that people buried their dead, but also that they invested immense effort, time, and resources into the act. In these burials, death became a stage for identity, community, and meaning. The most famous discoveries at Sungir are the graves of two children, buried side by side. Their skeletons lay stretched out, carefully positioned. Covering their bodies were thousands of ivory beads, carved painstakingly from mammoth tusk. Archaeologists estimate that more than 3,000 beads adorned the children, sewn into clothing or scattered across the graves. Each bead required hours of shaping and polishing. Together, they represent years of labor. To place them in a grave was to dedicate enormous resources to the dead. Alongside the beads lay other objects, long ivory spears, fox teeth pendants, and ornaments carved with precision. The spears, made from mammoth ivory, stretched more than 2 meters in length. They were finely crafted, far beyond what would be needed for ordinary hunting. Their presence suggests symbolic value, perhaps as status markers, perhaps as gifts for the journey beyond life, or perhaps as expressions of group identity. Whatever the interpretation, they show that the burials at Sungir were more than practical disposal. They were ritual in the deepest sense. Another adult burial at the site reinforces this pattern. The man was laid to rest with beads, bracelets, and carvings. Around him, ochre was sprinkled, staining bones and soil with red pigment. The inclusion of ochre connects Sungir to much earlier traditions seen at Kafse, school, and African sites. Despite vast distances in time and space, the choice to mark the dead with red remained. This continuity suggests a symbolic link stretching across tens of thousands of years. The scale of the Sungir ornaments sets the site apart. Each ivory bead required hours of labor to shape with stone tools. The sheer number means that years of collective effort were invested in producing objects ultimately placed in graves. This raises important questions. Why dedicate so much energy to the dead? What did it mean for the living to expend resources that could never be used again? Some scholars suggest the act reinforced group identity, showing that even in scarcity, the community could afford to give generously to their dead. Others see the burials as evidence of status or hierarchy, with the most lavish graves reserved for individuals of importance. A lesser-known detail from Sungir is the symmetry of the children's burial. The two bodies were placed head to head, their ornaments mirrored in arrangement. Such deliberate design indicates ritual planning. It was not random. The symmetry suggests symbolic thought, perhaps representing duality, kinship, or balance. The meaning is lost, but the care in arrangement remains clear. The planetary context is also striking. At the time of the Sungir burials, Europe lay deep in Ice Age conditions. Glaciers covered vast areas to the north. Steppe tundra stretched across Russia, populated by mammoth, reindeer, and woolly rhinoceros. Winters were long and severe, summers brief. In such conditions, survival demanded constant effort. Yet amid the challenges, people at Sungir devoted extraordinary labor to rituals of burial. It shows that symbolic life was not secondary to survival, but integrated with it. The unresolved mystery lies in interpretation. Were these burials signs of social inequality, with certain individuals receiving far more elaborate treatment? Or were they communal expressions, where the entire group contributed to honor its members? Some archaeologists argue for hierarchy, pointing to the wealth of ornaments in the children's graves compared to simpler burials elsewhere. Others note that children, unlikely to have achieved high status in life, were given the most elaborate rites, suggesting that symbolism outweighed social rank. The debate continues. Another planetary observation comes from the material itself. The ivory beads and spears required mammoth tusks, obtained either through hunting or scavenging. The use of such material ties human ritual directly to Ice Age megafauna. The fate of mammoths and the rituals of humans were bound together. To carve tusk into ornaments was to transform the largest creatures of the steppe into symbols for the dead. Step by step, the evidence at Sungir expands our understanding of early symbolic behavior. It shows that humans were not only capable of ritual, but invested heavily in it. The dead were not left alone. They were clothed in beads, armed with spears, surrounded by pigment, and laid with symmetry. Each choice reflected planning, memory, and intention. A detail that highlights this comes from microscopic analysis of the beads. Wear patterns show that many had been strung and worn in life before being placed in the graves. The dead, then, were not only adorned with newly made ornaments, but also with objects that carried history. Clothing and jewelry that had been part of daily life became part of ritual death. This layering of meaning reveals deep symbolic continuity. Archaeologists working at Sungir emphasize how exceptional the site is. Few burials anywhere in the Paleolithic match its richness. Yet the very existence of Sungir shows that humans of this time were capable of remarkable symbolic expression. They were not simply surviving in Ice Age steppes. They were shaping meaning, crafting beauty, and embedding identity into ritual. Imagine the scene more than 34,000 years ago. The cold winds sweep across the open plain. Inside a sheltered area, a group gathers. Two children lie side by side. Around them, people place beads, spears, and ornaments. Red ochre is sprinkled. The bodies are arranged with care, their positions mirrored. Hours, perhaps days, are spent preparing the grave. When it is complete, the earth is closed over, but the memory endures within the community. Today, archaeologists uncover those graves and count the thousands of beads, each shaped by ancient hands. They measure, date, and analyze. They debate whether the burials signal status, symbolism, or belief. Yet the evidence itself is enough to show that humans at Sungir lived in a world of meaning as well as survival. On a planetary scale too, Sungir demonstrates how ritual bound communities together across the vastness of the Ice Age world, from ochre-stained bones in Africa to ivory-beaded children in Russia. Burial became a universal human act. It was not identical everywhere, but it carried the same recognition that death required more than silence. It required ceremony. The Sungir burials remain among the most moving in archaeology. They show that 34,000 years ago, people already shaped lives with symbols and honored their dead with devotion measured not only in labor, but also in beauty. In the heart of Central Europe, where rolling hills meet wide rivers, lies one of the most enigmatic burial sites of the Upper Paleolithic. Dolní Věstonice, in present-day Moravia of the Czech Republic, is best known for its remarkable art. The famous clay figurines of animals and humans fired in primitive kilns over 25,000 years ago. Yet just as striking as its art are its burials. The graves at Dolní Věstonice reveal unusual arrangements, bodies positioned in ways that invite questions about kinship, symbolism, and the stories people may have told about death. The most famous discovery is a triple burial uncovered in the 1980s. 3 young individuals were placed side by side in a single grave. Their bodies, dated to around 26,000 years ago, were arranged with clear intention. One lay on the left side, facing inward. Another was placed on the back. The third lay on the right side, also facing inward. Their heads were aligned together, their bodies forming a triangular composition. Red ochre covered the bones, staining them with the same pigment seen at earlier sites such as Kafse and Sungir. This deliberate arrangement transformed the grave into a scene, almost like a tableau, frozen in soil for millennia. Archaeologists studying the triple burial noticed further peculiarities. One skeleton appeared to have had a physical deformity, a shortened limb, or facial asymmetry. Another showed evidence of trauma. The positions themselves suggested complexity. One individual's arm extended over the pelvis of another, while the central figure was placed supine, as if framed by the companions. Such details led scholars to propose that the arrangement held symbolic meaning, perhaps connected to myths, rituals, or social roles. What is most intriguing is that these individuals were buried together at all. Burials in the Paleolithic often involved single graves, sometimes richly furnished, sometimes modest. A shared grave of three young people, carefully positioned, suggests a story. Were they siblings? Members of the same group who died at the same time? Or were they chosen deliberately to embody a symbolic narrative in death? No final answer is possible, but the unusual nature of the burial ensures its importance. Another grave at Dolny Viestonitz contained the remains of a woman aged around 40, one of the oldest female skeletons of the site. Her body was covered with red ochre, and near her were ornaments, including teeth of Arctic foxes pierced for suspension. She lay near structures associated with dwellings, showing that burials were sometimes placed close to where the living carried out daily tasks. This proximity suggests that the dead were not isolated but remained integrated within the community's spatial world. A lesser-known detail from Dolny Viestonitz comes from the discovery of textile impressions in clay fragments. These impressions show that people wove fibers into nets, ropes, or fabrics. While not directly tied to burials, they provide context. The same people who buried their dead with ochre and ornaments also crafted nets to hunt small animals and woven bands to tie objects. The world of Dolny Viestonitz was one of both survival and artistry, with symbolic practices interwoven with practical skills. The planetary context of these burials is again the last glacial maximum. Vast ice sheets stretched across northern Europe. The climate was cold and dry, dominated by open tundra steppe where mammoth, horse, and reindeer grazed. The people of Dolny Viestonitz hunted these animals, especially mammoth, whose bones were used not only for food but also for constructing dwellings. Amid such an environment, survival was demanding, yet burial practices show that ritual remained central. Even in scarcity, the people expended effort and pigment to transform death into ceremony. The unresolved mystery of Dolny Viestonitz lies in interpretation. What did the triple burial mean? Some scholars suggest it reflects kinship, a family placed together in death. Others argue it represents ritual sacrifice, perhaps linked to fertility or myth, especially since the site is associated with Venus figurines symbolizing the human form. Still others see it as a combination, a real event of multiple deaths framed symbolically through burial arrangement. Triangular positioning, unusual in prehistoric graves, seems unlikely to be accidental. Another planetary observation comes from the widespread use of red ochre in these burials, from Africa to Russia, from Sungir to Dolní Věstonice, the same pigment appears, linking distant peoples in a shared tradition. At Dolní Věstonice, the ochre was not just sprinkled randomly but applied in ways that enhanced the visibility of the bodies. In firelight, the pigment would have glowed, marking the burial as a dramatic and visual act. One aspect that highlights the depth of ritual here is the combination of material culture. In a single site, archaeologists find fired figurines, woven textile impressions, mammoth bone dwellings, and complex burials. This convergence shows that the community lived in a symbolic world as much as a physical one. They shaped clay into animals, buried their dead with ochre, and built homes from mammoth bones. The material traces together paint a picture of a society deeply engaged in meaning-making. Imagine the scene 26,000 years ago. A grave dug into frozen ground. 3 young individuals laid side by side, heads aligned, arms overlapping, pigment sprinkled across bodies. Around them, others watch in silence. Some carry fox teeth or ornaments. Some bring ochre, ground from stone into powder. As the bodies are covered, the grave becomes more than a pit. It becomes a story told in earth and color. The meaning is lost to us, but it was clear to them. For archaeologists today, Dolní Věstonice is a site of fascination not only for its art, but also for its burials. The triple grave continues to raise questions about ritual, myth, and symbolism. The woman with fox teeth ornaments shows how identity and adornment were carried into death. The ochre stains and careful placements speak of a cultural world where survival and ritual coexisted. Step by step, Dolní Věstonice expands the picture of Upper Paleolithic life. It shows that humans were not only hunters and gatherers, but also creators of symbols, storytellers without writing, artists of clay and pigment, and mourners who transformed death into narrative. Its burials remain among the most mysterious in prehistory, challenging us to imagine a world where myth, ritual, and survival were inseparable. On the western edge of Europe, in the limestone valleys of Portugal, lies one of the most intriguing burials of the late Paleolithic, the Lepedo Child. This skeleton, discovered in 1998 in the Lagar Velho rock shelter near the village of Lepedo, provides not only evidence of careful burial but also an extraordinary glimpse into the complex interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The child's bones, preserved under layers of soil and ochre, tell a story that stretches beyond one life, raising questions about identity, ancestry, and the mingling of 2 human worlds. The burial dates to around 24,000 years ago, a period when modern humans had spread widely across Europe, but Neanderthals had only recently disappeared. Archaeologists excavating the site found the skeleton of a 4-year-old child laid carefully in a shallow grave. The body was covered with red ochre, a pigment seen in burials from Africa to Russia, tying this site into a long tradition of symbolic use. Near the skeleton were pierced shell ornaments and the bones of animals, suggesting that objects of meaning were placed with the body. What made the Lepedo Child remarkable was not only the presence of ochre and ornaments, but also the structure of the bones themselves. Anthropologists noted features typical of both modern humans and Neanderthals. The proportions of the limb bones and the shape of the jaw, and certain details of the skull suggested a blend. Some researchers proposed that the child represented a hybrid, the offspring of mixed ancestry between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. If true, the burial was not only symbolic, but also a direct record of interaction between two species. This interpretation sparked intense debate. Some scholars argued that the features could simply reflect variation within Homo sapiens, not necessarily hybridization. Others pointed out that the timing was plausible. Modern humans had arrived in Iberia while small populations of Neanderthals still survived. Genetic studies now confirm that interbreeding between the two groups occurred elsewhere, leaving traces of Neanderthal DNA in all non-African populations today. The Lopado child, whether a hybrid or not, embodies this meeting of worlds in its bones. A lesser-known detail of the burial is the child's clothing. The distribution of beads and ornaments suggests that the body was dressed in a decorated garment, perhaps a small tunic or wrap. As the garment decayed, beads fell into place around the skeleton. This interpretation shows that clothing, identity, and adornment were as important in death as in life. Even a young child, who had lived only a few years, was honored with care, pigment, and ornamentation. The planetary context of this burial situates it in a Europe undergoing dramatic change. Around 24,000 years ago, glaciers extended across northern latitudes, shaping winds and climate. The Iberian Peninsula, though far from the ice sheets, experienced cold and dry conditions. Herds of red deer, ibex, and horses roamed the valleys, hunted by small groups of humans who sheltered in caves and rock overhangs. In such a challenging environment, survival required constant effort. Yet the burial of the Lopado child shows that symbolic practices remained vital, even in scarcity. The living devoted energy to honoring their dead. The unresolved mystery, of course, is ancestry. Was this child truly a hybrid, carrying both Neanderthal and modern traits? Or do the bones simply reflect variation within early European Homo sapiens? The debate continues. Without preserved DNA from the skeleton, the answer remains uncertain. But the possibility alone highlights the closeness of the two human groups, their contact, and their shared rituals of burial. The red ochre sprinkled across the grave links the Lopado child to a much older tradition. From Kafse in Israel to Sungir in Russia, ochre-stained bones and soil in burials across continents. Its persistence shows a deep continuity of symbolic practice. In Portugal, the tradition lived on, carried into the late Paleolithic, shaping the burial of even the youngest. Another planetary observation concerns migration. The ancestors of the Lopado child's community were part of the broader movement of Homo sapiens into Europe more than 30,000 years earlier. These migrations brought new tools, art, and rituals. They also brought contact with Neanderthals, who had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. The child's bones, blending traits from both lineages, symbolize this meeting of populations at the edge of survival. Step by step, the burial reveals layers of meaning. The ochre shows connection to shared traditions. The ornaments suggest identity, possibly group membership or kinship. The careful placement of the body indicates ritual. And the skeletal features hint at ancestry that transcends species boundaries. Altogether, the grave is more than a resting place. It is a story carved into earth and bone. Archaeologists examining the burial emphasize the care shown by the community. To dig a pit, sprinkle ochre, arrange ornaments, and cover the child with soil required time and intention. The act speaks of grief, memory, and symbolism. Even for a young child, ritual was not withheld, and instead, it was elaborated, ensuring that the community's values extended to every member, regardless of age. Imagine the scene 24,000 years ago in the valley near Lepedo. The cold wind moves through the scrub and stone. A small group gathers around a shallow pit. In it lies the body of a child, dressed in a garment adorned with beads. Someone scatters red ochre across the body. Shells, carried from the coast, are placed nearby. Slowly, earth covers the child. The burial is complete. In silence, the group acknowledges both loss and continuity. For modern science, the Lepedo child stands as a bridge. It connects symbolic ritual to biological ancestry. It reminds us that human history is not a simple line, but a braided stream, with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacting, overlapping, and sharing practices. Even as one lineage faded, traces of their presence lived on in DNA, in bones, and perhaps in the very rituals of burial. On a planetary scale, the Lepedo burial highlights the universality of ritual across human group, whether hybrid or not. The child was treated with the same symbolic care seen in Africa, the Levant, Russia, and Central Europe. Burial with ochre and ornaments was not confined to one population, but shared across the human world. The Lepedo child remains one of the most poignant discoveries of prehistory. It embodies both continuity and encounter, both tradition and change. It shows that even in the deep past, humans marked death with meaning, and that meaning sometimes carried the traces of two lineages woven into one. Along the winding course of the Nile, where shifting climates alternately nourished green floodplains and left behind dry desert, archaeologists have uncovered a sequence of burials that trace the evolution of funerary practice over tens of thousands of years. The Nile Valley, stretching from its headwaters to the Mediterranean, has long been a corridor of human life. Its soils were fertile in periods of strong floods, sustaining fish, plants, and grazing animals. Yet, when the rains faltered or glaciers far to the north locked water into ice, the valley shrank into a lifeline of survival. In this corridor, the dead were placed into earth in ways that gradually became more elaborate, reflecting not only practical disposal, but growing ritual. The earliest burials along the Nile are simple pits. Bodies were laid on their sides, knees drawn toward the chest, in a flexed position, covered lightly with soil. Such burials, dating back more than 50,000 years, resemble those found elsewhere in Africa and the Levant. They show continuity with early Homo sapiens traditions, where the dead were placed with intention, though without great ceremony. The flexed position may have mirrored the posture of sleep or the curled form of the unborn, suggesting a symbolic link between life and death. Red ochre sometimes appears in these graves, connecting the Nile sites with the broader ochre tradition stretching back to Kafze and Blombos. By around 20,000 years ago, as climatic shifts altered the valley, burials began to change. Archaeologists at sites such as Wadi Kubaniya in southern Egypt uncovered remains of individuals buried with stone tools and animal bones. These inclusions may have been practical, perhaps items useful in another life, or symbolic, perhaps gifts marking identity. The shift from simple pits to burials with objects reflects the growing role of ritual. The Nile, always a place of abundance and scarcity, provided the stage for these changes. One lesser-known detail comes from the site of Jebel Sahaba, near the Nile in what is now northern Sudan. Dating to around 13,000 years ago, the cemetery contained dozens of skeletons, many with embedded stone points. These individuals had died violently, perhaps in conflict between groups during a time of environmental stress. Yet even here, the dead were gathered and buried in a collective cemetery. Their graves are among the earliest evidence of organized burial grounds in Africa. While the violence is stark, the act of burial reveals continuity of care. Even in conflict, the dead were not left exposed but given ritual closure. The planetary context of these burials is striking. Around these times, the Earth was in the grip of major climatic shifts. Glacial periods locked vast amounts of water in ice sheets, lowering sea levels and changing rainfall patterns. The Sahara oscillated between green savanna and arid desert. When rains were strong, rivers flowed across what is now barren sand, feeding into the Nile. When the climate dried, groups clustered tightly along the valley. In both conditions, burial practices endured, adapted, and evolved. By the beginning of the Holocene, around 10,000 years ago, burials along the Nile became more elaborate still. At sites such as Tushka in southern Egypt, bodies were placed with ornaments of shells and beads, sometimes carried from distant coasts. The inclusion of marine shells so far inland demonstrates long-distance connections. It also ties Nile Valley burials into the wider symbolic world of humans across Africa and the Mediterranean. Another unresolved question concerns the placement of burials within settlements. Some sites show bodies interred near dwellings, while others have cemeteries set apart. The variation suggests flexibility in ritual practice. In some cases, the dead may have remained close to the living, reinforcing continuity of community. In others, the separation of burial grounds may have marked a growing distinction between spaces for life and spaces for memory. A planetary observation can be made about rivers themselves. Throughout prehistory, rivers acted as anchors for both survival and ritual. The Nile, with its dependable though shifting floods, provided food, water, and mobility. To bury a body along its banks was to place it within the very source of life. This connection between rivers and death recurs globally, from the Indus to the Tigris. But along the Nile, it left some of the deepest and longest records. Archaeologists also note the presence of ochre in later Nile burials, echoing much earlier traditions. Even as tools advanced and ornaments multiplied, the sprinkling of red pigment endured. The continuity suggests that the symbolism of ochre remained strong, uniting burials across tens of millennia. Its persistence underscores the depth of human attachment to color as symbol. One particularly interesting detail comes from Gebel Sahaba again, where skeletons show signs of repeated injuries. Some individuals had survived earlier wounds before eventually dying violently. Their inclusion in the cemetery indicates that memory of survival, struggle, and eventual death was acknowledged communally. This mixture of violence and ritual burial reflects the dual realities of human life during climatic stress: competition and care, conflict and continuity. Step by step, the Nile Valley burials illustrate a trajectory from simple flexed burials in shallow pits to graves with tools and ornaments to cemeteries with dozens of individuals. The practice became more complex. The changes paralleled shifts in climate, subsistence, and social organization. Yet at every stage, burial remained central. Death was not ignored. It was given place, pigment, and often objects that carried meaning. Imagine the scene on a Nile floodplain 15,000 years ago. A small group gathers as the sun sets, the river glinting with evening light. A shallow grave has been dug near the edge of camp. A body lies inside. knees drawn close. Stone tools and beads are placed beside it. Red ochre is sprinkled across the soil. Slowly, the pit is filled. The river flows on, carrying water northward, linking this burial to countless others along its banks. For modern archaeology, the Nile Valley provides continuity across immense timescales, from the late Paleolithic into the Neolithic, and eventually into the early civilizations of Egypt. Burial practices evolved but never disappeared. The Lepedo child in Portugal shows blending of lineages. Sungir in Russia shows lavish ornament. Dolny Vestenica shows symbolic tableau. And the Nile adds another dimension, the long, slow development of funerary traditions that would one day culminate in monumental tombs and pyramids. The unresolved mystery of these early Nile burials is how people understood death. Did they imagine an afterlife flowing like the river, a journey beyond the horizon? Did ochre mark transformation? Did beads and shells act as symbols of status, protection, or remembrance? Archaeology cannot answer definitively, but the graves themselves, preserved in soil and stone, tell us that memory and ritual mattered. On a planetary scale, the Nile burials remind us that human symbolic thought was not confined to one region. From Africa to Europe, from Asia to the farthest coasts, people buried their dead with intention. The Nile's contribution is to show how rituals deepened over time, adapting to new climates and communities. The story of the Nile burials is thus not only about individual graves, but about continuity across millennia. From simple pits to cemeteries, from ochre to ornaments, from scattered bones to organized rows, the valley charts the long path of human care for the dead. It is a path that leads forward into history, but its roots lie deep in prehistory, in the soil of the river's banks. Where today the Sahara stretches as a vast expanse of stone and sand, its silence broken only by dry winds, there once existed lakes, rivers, and wide green plains. This green Sahara was not permanent. It emerged during humid phases when Earth's orbit shifted the pattern of monsoon rains, pulling wet seasons northward. Between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, this arid desert bloomed into grasslands, dotted with lakes where fish swam, hippos grazed, and crocodiles basked. Humans thrived here, leaving behind campsites, tools, ornaments, and, most strikingly, cemeteries that tell of how death was marked in this lost world. The site of Gobero, in present-day Niger, stands as the most evocative example. Discovered in 2000, it preserves dozens of burials spanning two distinct periods of occupation. The first community, around 9,000 years ago, were hunter-fishers who lived beside a great freshwater lake. The second, around 5,000 years ago, were herders who returned after centuries of abandonment when rains came again. Both groups buried their dead with care, leaving a record of ritual that endured long after the lake dried away. In the older phase, skeletons were often found in flexed positions, knees drawn tightly to the chest. This posture, common across early burials worldwide, may have echoed the form of sleep or birth, symbolizing a cycle of life. Red ochre was sprinkled on several skeletons, tying Gobero into the much broader ochre tradition seen from Africa to Eurasia. Grave goods included beads carved from hippo ivory, stone tools, and shells carried from distant coasts. Each object required labor to obtain. To place them in graves was to give them up for ritual purposes, reinforcing the importance of memory and identity. In the later phase, herding communities returned, with cattle, goats, and new stone tool traditions. Their burials show changes. Individuals were laid out extended, arms at their sides, sometimes adorned with green stone ornaments or cattle bones. One grave, among the most poignant, held an adult woman and two children buried together. Their arms were interlaced, as if embracing in death. This striking arrangement suggests more than practicality. It implies symbolism, kinship, protection, or an expression of love carried into ritual form. A lesser-known but important detail is the diet revealed through isotopic analysis of bones. In the early hunter-fisher phase, people relied heavily on aquatic resources, fish, turtles, and hippos from the lake. In the later herder phase, terrestrial animals like cattle and antelope became primary. This dramatic dietary shift illustrates human adaptation to climate change. Yet in both periods, burial remained central. Regardless of food sources or tools, communities invested in ritual care for their dead. The planetary backdrop gives these cemeteries deeper meaning. The Sahara is governed by long-term climate cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles, where changes in Earth's orbit and tilt affect the reach of monsoon rains. Every 20,000 years or so, rainfall moves northward, greening the desert. Then it withdraws, leaving aridity behind. Human lives were bound to these cycles. Gobero represents one of those green phases. When the rains ended, people left, but their cemeteries remained, preserved beneath advancing sands. The unresolved mystery is what the burials meant to those who dug them. Did the flexed bodies with ochre represent transformation, a return to earth? Did cattle bones symbolize wealth or spiritual guardianship? Were the intertwined family members buried to preserve bonds beyond life, or to act out a story told in myth? Archaeologists cannot know. What we see are positions, pigments, and objects. The meanings are hidden, but the repetition of care is unmistakable. Other green Sahara sites confirm the pattern. In Libya, at Uan Muhugyag, burials of children were placed with grave goods, one even wrapped in animal skin, showing extraordinary attention. In Mali and Chad, cemeteries appear beside vanished lakes, their graves containing ornaments of ostrich eggshell beads and stone tools. Together, they form a network across the Sahara, proving that the desert once supported thriving symbolic cultures. One particularly evocative grave at Gobero contained an adult female adorned with jewelry made from hippopotamus ivory. To wear hippo ivory was to carry the essence of the watery world itself. In death, that connection was preserved, binding the person to the lake's abundance. The material of the ornaments, like the ivory spears of Sungir, tied ritual to environment, transforming animals into symbols of human identity. Another detail of note is the presence of children in these cemeteries, like at Sungir and Dolny Vestanits. Infants and young individuals were not excluded from ritual. They were buried with beads and pigment, treated with the same care as adults. This continuity reveals that symbolic value extended to all members of society, regardless of age or role. In this sense, burial was not only about honoring individuals, but about affirming the entire community. The planetary observation from these green Sahara burials is the fragility of human landscapes. The graves now lie in desert sands where no lakes remain, where fish and hippos have vanished, and where survival without modern technology is nearly impossible. Yet the skeletons, pigments, and ornaments endure. They remind us that entire worlds can vanish with climate shifts, leaving cemeteries as the last testimony of once flourishing societies. Imagine Gobero 7,000 years ago. The lake stretches across the horizon, reflecting the sky. Herds of cattle graze at its edges. Reeds rustle with birds. In a clearing near the shore, a grave is dug. A woman and 2 children are laid within, their arms entwined. Beads are placed on their garments. Ochre is scattered, glowing red in firelight. The pit is filled, but the memory lingers. For the community, the act transforms death into connection, binding the living and the dead to the lake and to each other. When the rains retreated and the Sahara dried, those communities moved on to the Nile Valley, to the Sahel, to regions where water still flowed. The cemeteries were abandoned, left to sand and time. Millennia later, archaeologists uncovered them, finding skeletons still clasped together, pigments still staining bones, ornaments still lying where they were placed. These graves carry voices across time, whispers of ritual, of memory, of humanity adapting to shifting worlds. The Green Sahara dead remind us that ritual persists even amid dramatic environmental change. Food sources shift, tools evolve, animals come and go, but the act of burial endures. To cover the dead, to place them with objects, to stain them with color. These gestures link people across continents and millennia. On a planetary scale, the Green Sahara cemeteries stand as records of vanished ecosystems and enduring human meaning. They show how humans have always lived in rhythm with Earth's cycles, how they have adapted to abundance and scarcity, and how they have embedded ritual in landscapes that no longer exist. Today, dunes cover Gobero and other sites, but beneath the sand lie graves that once overlooked lakes, proving that even in the most fragile environments, humans marked death with ceremony and memory. At the northern edge of modern Sudan, near the second cataract of the Nile, lies the site of Jebel Sahaba. Today it is a barren desert of wind, stone, and sparse vegetation. 13,000 years ago it was different. The river carved a green ribbon through an arid land, attracting people, animals, and plants alike. Here, archaeologists discovered one of the oldest cemeteries known in Africa, and one of the most haunting. The burials speak of both violence and resilience, of death amid conflict, and of the persistence of ritual even when survival was threatened. The cemetery was found in the 1960s during excavations before the rising waters of the Aswan High Dam would flood nearby areas. More than 60 burials were uncovered. Men, women, and children lay in shallow graves. Some curled on their sides, some stretched on their backs. Bones were often stained with red ochre, and in some graves stone tools or ornaments rested beside the dead. This was not casual disposal. It was deliberate burial, repeated across generations, turning a terrace above the Nile into a place of memory. The most striking feature of the burials, however, was the violence. Nearly half the skeletons bore signs of trauma. Flint points were lodged in bones. Skulls showed fractures. Ribs and pelvises were pierced. Some skeletons carried dozens of embedded stone tips, the remains of arrows or spears. In one young woman, more than 20 flint points were found still lodged in her bones. Children, too, bore fatal wounds. This was not the isolated act of one raid. It was a pattern of repeated conflict. Many injuries had healed before death, showing that individuals had survived earlier attacks. People were struck, recovered, and struck again. The healed and unhealed wounds together suggest that violence was not a single massacre, but a chronic condition of life. Jebel Sahaba thus preserves a long record of tension along the Nile, a record carved not in texts but in bone. The broader context was climatic upheaval. Around 13,000 years ago, the world entered the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to cooler and drier conditions after the last ice age. In Africa, this meant the expansion of deserts, shrinking rainfall, and retreating lakes. Fertile land narrowed, forcing groups to cluster along rivers. The Nile became both lifeline and boundary. It sustained life with its fish, water plants, and fertile banks. But its limited resources also became points of competition. Groups pressed close together, and conflict followed. A lesser-known detail is that Jebel Sahaba is among the earliest known communal cemeteries on the continent. Before this, burials were often scattered or occasional. Here, dozens of individuals were laid together in one place. Despite conflict, the living returned again and again to this terrace to bury their dead. This suggests not only ritual practice, but also a sense of belonging to a shared landscape, even in turbulent times. Archaeologists studying the cemetery note that the tools used as weapons were the same as those used in hunting. Flint points that once brought down gazelle or fish were turned against humans. The technology of survival was also the technology of violence. The points are finely made, carefully chipped, standardized in size. They show skill, patience, and tradition. In them, we see both the ingenuity of early toolmakers and the harsh reality of their use in conflict. The presence of ochre in several graves links Jebel Sahaba to wider symbolic traditions. Across Africa, Europe, and the Near East, ochre was used in burials for tens of thousands of years. Its meaning remains uncertain. Some suggest it symbolized blood, life, or transformation. At Jebel Sahaba, its use demonstrates that ritual and symbolism were not abandoned even in times of stress. Care for the dead continued. Gestures of meaning were made, and burials carried more than practicality. Yet the mystery remains. What exactly happened at Jebel Sahaba? Was this community engaged in long feuds with neighboring groups? Were they attacked while fishing or traveling along the river? Did changing climate force confrontations over shrinking resources? Archaeology cannot answer fully. The bones tell us of trauma, of lives ended violently. They do not tell us the stories that once explained those events to the living. From a planetary perspective, the lessons are broad. The Younger Dryas reshaped environments across continents. In Europe, forests receded. In Asia, monsoons weakened. In Africa, the Sahara expanded. Everywhere, humans adjusted, adapted, or suffered. At Jebel Sahaba, we see one local outcome of this global shift. Climate stress translated into conflict, and conflict left marks that endure to this day. Despite the evidence of violence, the cemetery reflects resilience. Each grave, each act of burial shows continuity of care. The living took time to place pigment, to arrange bodies, to inter children with adults, to return repeatedly to the same ground. Jebel Sahaba is both a record of hostility and a record of humanity's insistence on meaning, even in hardship. Today, the site itself lies quiet. The desert has reclaimed it. The Nile flows nearby, as it has for millennia, carrying water through a land that once sustained small groups of foragers. The bones now rest in collections, studied with new methods. Isotopic analysis reveals diets heavy in fish. Microscopic study of flint points shows their use and repair. Each new technique adds detail, but the broad picture remains the same. Here, 13,000 years ago, people lived at the edge of survival, facing both climate stress and human conflict. Jebel Sahaba endures as a reminder. Violence is ancient, but so too is ritual. Scarcity and competition may fuel hostility, yet care for the dead persists. In this cemetery we see both sides of human nature inscribed in bone and pigment. The site is not just a record of death. It is a record of resilience, of meaning, and of how communities faced one of the most difficult periods of climatic change in human history. Far to the north, in the frozen expanses of Ice Age Europe, another remarkable set of burials appears. These are found at a site called Sungir, near present-day Vladimir in western Russia. More than 30,000 years ago, long before agriculture, people of the Upper Paleolithic gathered here on the cold plains. They hunted reindeer and horse, crafted ivory ornaments, and lived through harsh winters. What they left behind was extraordinary. Beneath the soil, archaeologists uncovered burials unlike almost any others of that era. Lavish graves filled with beads, spears, and layers of red ochre. Sungir stands as one of the most elaborate early burial sites in the world. The discoveries were first made in the mid-20th century, when excavations revealed a cluster of graves. Among them was the burial of an adult male laid out straight and sprinkled with ochre. But most astonishing were two children, buried side by side in a single grave. Their small skeletons were covered with more than 10,000 ivory beads, each one carefully carved from mammoth tusk. The children also had ivory spears, carved ornaments, and fox teeth pendants placed around them. The time invested in making and arranging these objects was immense. Each bead may have taken an hour to shape and polish. 10,000 beads represent thousands of hours of work. Such devotion signals extraordinary meaning. A lesser-known detail is the presence of asymmetry. The two children were not given identical objects. One had a longer spear, the other more fox teeth. Archaeologists debate what this difference means. Was it a marker of status, kinship, or a role imagined for the afterlife? Or did it simply reflect what was available when the grave was prepared? The answer remains uncertain. But the imbalance itself adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of these burials. The adult male buried at Sungir also carried remarkable items. His clothing was decorated with thousands of beads sewn into patterns. He was laid with ivory bracelets and carefully shaped carvings. Ochre covered his bones, echoing the ritual seen at much earlier sites. Unlike the children, however, the man's grave goods seemed more restrained, suggesting a distinction between the burials of adults and children. This difference challenges modern assumptions. Why were children given such extravagant treatment? Perhaps childhood carried symbolic power, or perhaps these individuals held special significance in the group's belief system. Sungir raises questions about social structure. In most Ice Age communities, daily life was egalitarian. Resources were shared, leadership was temporary, and wealth did not accumulate. Yet at Sungir, the investment of labor into certain burials suggests emerging forms of social differentiation. Some individuals were singled out for attention far beyond what survival required. Archaeologists see in these burials hints of hierarchy, ritual authority, or symbolic leadership. At the very least, the graves show that communities expressed identity and meaning through acts of extraordinary generosity toward the dead. From a planetary perspective, Sungir's richness also reflects the broader environment. Around 30,000 years ago, Ice Age steppes stretched across Eurasia. Herds of mammoths, horses, and reindeer roamed. Their bones and tusks provided material for tools, beads, and ornaments. Abundance of ivory made possible the thousands of beads in the children's graves. Without such access to large mammals, such elaborate burials would not have been feasible. In this sense, the richness of Sungir reflects not only cultural choice but also ecological opportunity. Yet history remains. What beliefs guided such elaborate preparation? Was the community imagining an afterlife where children needed weapons and ornaments? Were the beads offerings to spirits or ancestors? Or did the graves themselves serve the living, symbols of identity, demonstrations of care, or markers of territory? Archaeologists continue to debate. No single explanation captures the full picture. Another lesser-known fact is that the Sungir burials show evidence of careful planning. The graves were dug with precision, bodies were laid in specific orientations, ochre was applied consistently, beads were not scattered but sewn into clothing, indicating that garments were prepared specifically for burial. This preparation required time, collaboration, and ritual sequence. The community came together, investing effort far beyond the practical need to cover a body. Such coordination suggests that burial ceremonies may have been events of collective significance, reinforcing bonds among the living. The Sungir site also contained other burials, less lavish, with fewer objects and simpler arrangements. This contrast underscores inequality. Not everyone received thousands of beads or finely carved spears. Some were buried with only minimal care. These differences reveal that even in deep prehistory, human groups could distinguish between individuals, assigning varying levels of ritual importance. The ivory objects themselves provide further insight. Among them were carefully shaped rods and carvings that do not appear to have had practical functions. Their forms suggest symbolic or ceremonial use. This points to abstract thinking, imagination, and perhaps myth. In crafting such items, the people of Sungir were engaging in behavior that went far beyond survival. They were shaping symbols to accompany their dead. On a wider scale, Sungir is part of a pattern across Ice Age Europe. Burials with beads, ornaments, and ochre appear from France to Russia, though rarely with the same intensity. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech lands, a triple burial of 2 young women and a man was similarly rich with beads and pigments. These examples hint at shared traditions of ritual, carried across the plains by networks of interaction. Ideas of how to bury the dead, what symbols to include, and how to mark the body spread across wide territories. Still, Sungir remains among the most lavish. The sheer number of beads, the scale of investment, and the care of arrangement set it apart. For archaeologists, it demonstrates that even 30,000 years ago, humans were capable of highly elaborate symbolic expression. Social bonds, belief systems, and ritual practices were already deeply embedded in life. The site also preserves evidence of everyday existence. Hearths, stone tools, and animal bones show how people lived. They hunted horses and reindeer, used stone blades for cutting, and relied on fire for warmth and cooking. Against this background of practical survival, the grandeur of the burials stands out even more sharply. The contrast reveals the human capacity to create meaning far beyond necessity, to transform death into occasions of memory and symbolism. Today, Sungir lies beneath layers of soil and grass on the Russian plain. Its graves remain a touchstone for archaeologists seeking to understand the emergence of ritual complexity. The beads, spears, and ochre, together, speak of a community that chose to invest in the dead, not because it was required, but because it mattered to their identity and imagination. The mystery persists. We may never know what stories were told as beads were sewn, as ochre was sprinkled, as graves were closed. But the evidence is clear. At Songir, burial was not an afterthought. It was a central act of cultural life, binding community, memory, and belief. In the flatlands of central Anatolia, a settlement once thrived where people lived in close-packed houses with shared walls, no streets, and rooftops serving as pathways. This place is known as Çatalhöyük. Around 9,000 years ago, in the early Neolithic, it became one of the largest communities of its time. Thousands of people lived here, farming, herding, and crafting. But Çatalhöyük is remembered not only for its dense architecture and painted walls. It is also remarkable for how the community treated its dead. Beneath the very floors where families slept, cooked, and gathered, the dead were laid to rest. Life and death intertwined in the same space, creating one of the most striking burial traditions of the early agricultural world. Excavations at Çatalhöyük reveal that burials were placed in pits dug beneath house platforms. Adults and children alike were interred beneath the plastered floors. Over time, multiple bodies accumulated within a single house. Archaeologists have found some houses containing more than 60 individuals, their skeletons layered carefully beneath living spaces. The choice of location was deliberate. By burying the dead under their homes, people tied ancestry, memory, and daily life together. Every step across the floor was also a step above generations of kin. The burials themselves were not uniform. Some individuals were covered with red ochre, echoing symbolic practices known from much earlier sites. Others were buried with beads, tools, or ornaments. A few were interred with animal parts, such as horns or jaws, linking human and animal worlds in ritual symbolism. Infants and children often appear in these burials, showing that even the youngest were incorporated into the community's cycle of memory. These practices reveal a worldview where death was not separate from life but woven into its fabric. One lesser-known detail is the removal and reburial of skulls. At Çatalhöyük, archaeologists found evidence that some skulls were taken from earlier burials, plastered or painted, and then displayed or reburied. And this echoes practices also found in other parts of the Near East during the Neolithic, where skull cults honored ancestors by reshaping and decorating their remains. At Çatalhöyük, painted walls often carried images of bulls, vultures, and human figures. The connection between these symbolic images and the treatment of skulls suggests a complex system of belief linking death, fertility, and continuity. The painted walls themselves deepen the picture. Many houses were decorated with red ochre images, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, and symbolic motifs. In some cases, these paintings were renewed repeatedly, layered one upon another over years. The association of burials beneath and paintings above suggests that houses served not only as dwellings but also as ritual spaces. The act of painting may have accompanied the act of burial, binding the living and the dead through visual expression. Yet the meaning remains uncertain. Did the people of Çatalhöyük believe in an afterlife? Were the skulls of ancestors revered as protective spirits? Or were the practices focused on memory, identity, and social ties rather than belief in other worlds? Archaeologists debate these questions, pointing out that symbolism in Neolithic societies often carried multiple layers. What is clear is that burial at Çatalhöyük was not only disposal, but an active part of social and spiritual life. From a planetary perspective, Çatalhöyük emerged at a turning point. Agriculture was spreading across the Near East. Climate stability after the Ice Age allowed farming to flourish. People grew wheat and barley, herded sheep and goats, and established permanent settlements. Population density rose. In this new environment, ideas of ancestry and lineage became more significant. Tying the dead to the household may have reinforced rights to land, resources, and memory. The burials beneath floors thus carried not only symbolic meaning, but also practical significance in a world where territory and inheritance began to matter. Another striking feature is the absence of large public monuments. Unlike later societies that built megaliths or temples, Çatalhöyük's ritual life was embedded in everyday spaces. Each house was both home and shrine, both dwelling and tomb. The community's spiritual practices were decentralized, spread across hundreds of homes. This made the settlement unique, a city without streets, a community without temples, a world where ritual and daily life were inseparable. Archaeologists also note the cyclical nature of construction. Houses were built, lived in, abandoned, and rebuilt directly on top of earlier ones. In this process, burials accumulated, walls were repainted, and memory was layered physically in the architecture. Çatalhöyük is thus both a settlement and a time capsule, its layers recording centuries of repeated practice. The dead beneath each new floor became part of the foundation of the living. A mystery surrounds the variation in grave goods. While many individuals were buried with no ornaments, others carried beads, shells, or symbolic objects. The reasons for this difference remain unclear. Did it reflect social status, gender roles, or individual achievement? Or did certain deaths carry specific ritual importance? The evidence does not yield a single answer. What it shows is diversity, reminding us that even within one community, burial practices varied widely. The role of animals is another fascinating aspect. Our bullhorns, especially, appear repeatedly in both wall paintings and burials. In some houses, bull skulls were mounted on walls, plastered, and painted. In burials, horns were sometimes placed near bodies. These practices suggest that cattle held symbolic power, perhaps linked to fertility, strength, or cycles of life and death. The intertwining of human and animal remains points to a worldview in which humans were not separate from the natural world but deeply enmeshed within it. On a larger scale, Çatalhöyük connects with other Neolithic traditions across the Near East. From Jericho to Ain Ghazal, skull burials and plastered faces appear, shared symbols of ochre, animals, and geometric designs tie communities together across vast distances. The spread of these practices reflects networks of contact, exchange, and shared belief in a time when agriculture and settlement were transforming human life. Today, Çatalhöyük is a quiet mound rising from the Anatolian plain. Excavations have uncovered its dense housing, its burials, its wall paintings. Visitors walk among reconstructed rooms, seeing where people lived, died, and remembered. The site remains a window into a world where daily life was inseparable from ritual, where the dead lay beneath the feet of the living, and where painted walls told stories of ancestors and animals. The lessons of Çatalhöyük are profound. Burials were not set apart in cemeteries. They were integrated into households, binding family, land, and memory. Ritual was not confined to temples. It was woven into the rhythm of daily existence. And death was not removed from life, but part of its ongoing cycle. In these early farmers, we see the roots of traditions that would later expand into temples, tombs, and great monuments. But at Çatalhöyük, they remained intimate, domestic, and deeply human. Across the rolling grasslands of southern Britain, another chapter in the long story of burial rituals begins to unfold. This is the world of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, where communities built monuments of earth and stone, creating landscapes that blended daily life with memory and ceremony. Among the most striking of these are long barrows and passage tombs, built thousands of years before the more familiar circles of Stonehenge. These monuments stand as some of the earliest large-scale communal tombs in Europe, marking a new stage in humanity's relationship with the dead. Long barrows stretch across the English countryside. They are elongated mounds of earth and stone, often over 70 meters in length, covering chambers built from timber or megaliths. Inside these chambers, the bones of many individuals were placed together. Archaeologists have found remains of men, women, and children mixed in shared spaces, suggesting that these tombs were not for single burials, but for communities or lineages. Death, in this tradition, was collective. The living returned again and again to the tombs, adding new bodies, rearranging bones, and renewing rituals. One famous example is West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire. Built over 5,500 years ago, it consists of a long mound with a stone-lined passage leading to side chambers. Excavations revealed the remains of dozens of people, deposited over centuries. Some bones appear to have been rearranged deliberately, with skulls placed separately or bones grouped together. This suggests that bodies were not always interred intact. Instead, exposure, excarnation, or ritual manipulation may have preceded burial. The tomb thus functioned not only as a final resting place, but also as a place of ritual activity, where the relationship between the living and the dead was continually renewed. A lesser-known detail from these tombs is the evidence of selective inclusion. Not all community members were buried within the barrows. Some individuals, for reasons still debated, were chosen to rest within the chambers, while others were buried elsewhere or not preserved at all. This suggests that the barrows served as symbolic centers, reserved for specific groups, kin lineages, or people of ritual importance. The act of inclusion itself carried meaning, creating boundaries of identity and memory. The passage tombs of Ireland add another dimension. At Newgrange, built around 3200 BCE, a vast mound encases a long stone passage leading to a cruciform chamber. The walls and stones are carved with spirals, lozenges, and other abstract motifs. At the winter solstice, sunlight enters the passage and illuminates the inner chamber. This alignment links death and rebirth with the cycle of the sun. The tomb thus connects human mortality with cosmic rhythm, embedding burial in a planetary framework of time. The carvings at Newgrange remain enigmatic. Spirals, concentric circles, and zigzags decorate the stones. Archaeologists debate their meaning. Were they symbols of journeys, cycles, or visions experienced in altered states? Or were they simply marks of identity and tradition? The mystery persists, reminding us that the symbolic world of the Neolithic was rich and layered, yet beyond our full comprehension. From a planetary perspective, these monuments were built during a time of significant change. Farming communities had spread across Europe, clearing forests, domesticating animals, and cultivating crops. Population density rose, and ties to land deepened. Monumental tombs embodied these new connections. By building long barrows and passage tombs, communities inscribed their presence onto landscapes, linking ancestry and territory. The monuments were not only for the dead, they were also declarations of belonging, marking claims to land and identity across generations. Another mystery surrounds the labor involved. To build a tomb like Newgrange required thousands of tons of stone, carried from quarries kilometers away. The labor force must have been organized, coordinated, and sustained over long periods. For communities still dependent on farming and herding, this was a significant investment of time and energy. Why commit such resources to the dead? The answer lies in the symbolic power of ancestry and ritual. The monuments embodied the collective identity of communities, binding them together through shared labor and belief. Not all burials in this period were monumental. In some regions, simple pits, small cairns, or isolated graves continued alongside great tombs. The coexistence of monumental and modest practices reflects diversity. Some groups emphasized collective memory through large-scale monuments, while others focused on smaller, localized traditions. Together, they reveal the wide spectrum of human responses to death and memory in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. At Stonehenge, the story converges. Long before the iconic stone circle was erected, the site functioned as a burial ground. Excavations revealed cremated remains of dozens of individuals interred in pits around the earliest stages of the monument. This shows that Stonehenge began as a place of burial and memory, long before it became a circle of stones. The transformation from cemetery to monument illustrates how ritual landscapes evolved over time, carrying forward themes of death, memory, and cosmic alignment. A subtle but important observation is the shift from collective to individual emphasis. Early long barrows and passage tombs emphasized shared ancestry, with bones mingled together. Later, Bronze Age burials increasingly emphasized individuals, with single graves, mounds, and personal artifacts. This reflects a change in social structure, from communal to more hierarchical or lineage-based organization. The way communities buried their dead mirrored the way they organized their societies. Today, long barrows and passage tombs still stand in the landscapes of Britain and Ireland, their mounds softened by time, their chambers silent. Visitors walk into cool stone passages, feeling the weight of centuries above. The bones are gone, the rituals stilled, but the monuments endure. They remind us of a time when burial was not only a private act, but a public, monumental declaration. Death was tied to land, to sun, to ancestry, to the very cycles of the earth. The mystery of meaning remains. Why spirals? Why solstice light? Why choose some individuals for burial and not others? Archaeologists continue to study, to debate, to propose interpretations. Yet the core fact is clear. In these landscapes, the dead shaped the living, and the living reshaped the land in memory of the dead. Across the deep timeline of prehistory, the story of burial comes to a quiet but expansive reflection. From the earliest ochre-stained bones in Africa to the vast stone monuments of Europe, the long arc of ritual reveals something constant in human life. Communities paused, marked death, and returned again and again to places of memory. These acts span more than 100,000 years. They occur in caves, on river terraces, within deserts, and beneath monumental mounds. Together they form a pattern, humans shaping meaning from loss. The oldest burials, found at sites such as Kafsa in Israel, date back more than 90,000 years. Skeletons there were arranged deliberately, sometimes with ochre, sometimes with deer antlers placed upon the chest. In Shanidar Cave, Neanderthal skeletons lie with traces of pollen, perhaps from flowers. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a Neanderthal body was laid in a shallow pit, intentionally covered. These early gestures demonstrate that symbolic treatment of the dead is ancient, shared not only by modern humans but also by close relatives. The evidence is fragmentary, yet compelling. As the millennia passed, burial practices diversified. In Sungir, on the Russian plain, 2 children were buried with thousands of beads carved from mammoth ivory, each bead the result of careful hours of work. At Dolny Vestonitz, 3 bodies were interred together in unusual arrangement, one with twisted limbs. In Jebel Sahaba along the Nile, dozens were laid to rest in a communal cemetery, many bearing the marks of violent death. Each site reveals a distinct response, yet all share a refusal to let death pass unmarked. One lesser-known thread is the repeated use of red ochre. It appears in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia. Bodies are dusted with it, graves lined with it, bones stained by it. Its meaning remains debated. Some see it as symbol of blood, others as sign of renewal or transformation. The persistence of this pigment across continents and across tens of millennia suggests a deep-seated symbolic resonance. That so many different groups reached for the same substance to accompany their dead remains one of archaeology's quiet mysteries. With the Neolithic, burial became monumental. Farming communities settled the land, and with permanence came new forms of ritual. Long barrows stretched across Britain. Passage tombs rose in Ireland. Cairns dotted the highlands of Scotland. Within these structures, bones of many individuals were placed together. The architecture itself became part of the ritual, with chambers aligned to solstices, carvings cut into stone, and sunlight entering passages at specific times of year. Here, death was linked not only to community, but to the rhythms of the cosmos. From a planetary perspective, burial practices mirror wider transformations. During the Ice Age, glaciers advanced and retreated, shaping coastlines and altering rivers. Human groups adapted, moving into new environments, sometimes encountering other hominins. Burial sites mark these migrations. They appear in Levantine caves, on European plains, in Saharan lakeshores, and eventually across Asia and the Americas. As climates shifted, so too did traditions. Yet the act of ritual burial persisted. It is one of the few constants across a time span otherwise defined by change. The mysteries remain large. Did Neanderthals imagine a spirit world? Did the builders of Newgrange believe the sun's light guided the soul? Why were some people buried with thousands of beads, while others lay alone, with nothing? Why were skulls sometimes removed, plastered, and displayed in homes? Each question opens possibilities, but none can be answered with certainty. Archaeology gives evidence of practice, but intention lies beyond reach. Still, the persistence of burial rituals shows that humans saw themselves as more than survival. The placement of a body, the scattering of pigment, the raising of a mound. These actions mark a recognition that life continues in memory, that community does not end with death. even amid scarcity, violence, or migration. Time was given to ritual. Another subtle pattern lies in the transition from collective to individual emphasis. In early communal tombs, bones were mixed together, the dead remembered as groups rather than individuals. In later Bronze Age Europe, burials increasingly highlighted the individual, with single graves and personal possessions. This shift mirrors broader social change, from egalitarian groups toward more stratified societies. The way the dead were remembered reflected how the living were organized. Today, many of these sites remain silent but visible. Long barrows lie under grassy ridges. Passage tombs still align with solstice light. Caves preserve bones beneath layers of sediment. Excavated skeletons rest in museums, studied with isotopes, DNA, and microscopic analysis. Each discovery adds detail, but the core pattern remains. For over 100,000 years, humans and their relatives have marked death with ritual. From the global view of prehistory, burial practices link small communities to planetary cycles. Climate shaped migration. Migration carried rituals, and rituals reshaped landscapes. Monuments rose from earth and stone. Pigments were ground from minerals. Bones were placed in chambers, and passages aligned with the sun. Human memory became part of geology and astronomy, inscribed in both soil and sky. The reflection at the end of this long arc is clear but gentle. Burial rituals are among the oldest human traditions. They reveal that symbolic thought, memory, and meaning are not recent inventions, but ancient inheritances. They whisper across time that people long ago saw themselves as part of something larger, enduring beyond the span of one life. And still, questions remain unanswered. We do not know the words spoken at Kafse. We do not know the songs, if any, at Sungir. We do not know the stories told at Jebel Sahaba, or the prayers offered in the shadow of Newgrange. What we hold are traces, bones, pigment, carvings, beads, and stone. From these traces we build narratives, careful but incomplete. The mystery is part of what endures. Far across the landscapes of the world, ancient burials still rest, in caves, in deserts, in forgotten valleys, in mounds softened by grass. They remain. Some are yet undiscovered, hidden beneath sand or sea. They remind us that the story of humanity is unfinished, that the record of burial rituals is still expanding. Each discovery shifts the timeline, pushing the origins further back, showing that care for the dead is as old as humanity itself. At the quiet close of this journey, one thought lingers. Burial is memory made material. It is the bridge between living and dead, between present and past, between human life and planetary cycles. The earth preserves bones, and through them preserves memory. It preserves not only what is known, but also what is unknown, what is still to be uncovered. In the silence of these ancient sites, the lesson is steady. Ritual persists, memory endures, and the oldest known burials remain as whispers across time.